So if Joe Biden announces his running mate right out of the gate, presumably to deal with concerns about his age, is that a brilliant move or a huge mistake? And what if it's Stacey Abrams, as it looks like it might be? Your comments, and don't forget to subscribe. This was published first in Axios this morning. I got mine via Bob Ney with his, he sends a little news summary to all the radio stations that carry Talk Media News, as we do in the second hour of our program every day, when we just kind of check in for what's going on in the world. And the story is that a couple of days ago, Joe Biden asked Stacey Abrams to come to Washington, D.C. and have lunch with him. And apparently, she's 45 years old. She's 31 years younger than him. He's concerned that as an old white guy, he needs a young woman of color on his, as his vice president to balance his ticket, to show voters, and in fact, this is one of the sources close to Biden, to show voters that Biden isn't just another old white guy. Now, some of his advisors are quite opposed to this idea. They think that in a Democratic debate, one of the questions the debate questioner would ask is, why don't you think anybody else on this stage is worthy of being a running mate? And the idea that the move would be perceived as a gimmick, or even as, to use the language largely of a previous generation, that this would be tokenism. On the other hand, that even asking that question in some ways kind of is an insult to Stacey Abrams to suggest that she's anything less than, a rock star politician, because she is. She gave the Democratic response to Donald Trump, and it was the first one in years that wasn't screwed up, that really worked and worked well, and she did just a brilliant job. She damn near became governor of Georgia, and she would have if it wasn't for Brian, what's his name's, successful voter suppression. Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton said that an Abrams move could help Biden by mitigating objections to Biden's treatment of Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas hearings. Now, whether Al Sharpton is saying that by way of pointing out once again how poorly Joe Biden treated Anita Hill, or whether he's genuinely saying, yeah, great idea, put her on your ticket, I don't know. Let's assume it's the latter. And in fact, Michael Beschloss, the presidential historian, said, voters in the primary process deserve to know as much as possible about the future they are opting for. Should all the Democratic candidates be saying, well, if you nominate me, this is who I'm going to have as vice president, or this is who I would like to have as vice president, or this is who I've talked to about being vice president. I mean, Cory Booker came out the other day and said, if I'm at the top of the ticket, odds are very high, very strong. I'm paraphrasing from memory here, but very strong that I'm going to put a woman on as vice president. Which is, not an unreasonable thing to say, particularly given about half the field right now is female. It looks like, well, not half, but I believe there are 5 women right now in the Democratic primary campaign that's up to, 16, 18 people? Something like that. So, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that this is a huge mistake? If Joe Biden were to do this, were to come out and say, literally announce his candidacy with Stacey Abrams standing next to him and have her give part of the speech and announce it not as a Biden candidacy, but as a Biden-Abrams candidacy, or anybody else for that matter, is he making a mistake, or is he making a brilliant political move that we haven't seen in a long, long time? I mean, literally, and since the 19th century. Which is it? I could build an argument for either side, I suppose. And it would certainly be a bold political move. And I agree with this notion that Michael Beschloss is putting out that, we should know everything we can about a potential candidate, including, who they want as their number 2. And that, that sounds actually very appealing when you think about, I mean, the story that Nicholas, one of our chat room moderators over on Twitter, or on YouTube, who lives in Mexico most of the year, called into the show a week or three ago and pointed out that AMLO, the current president of Mexico, the Bernie Sanders of Mexico, who got elected president of Mexico right now, and, is running the country in a very progressive way, that the bold move that he took, the extraordinary thing that he did that catapulted him into the Mexican version of the White House, is that during the campaign, he not only announced his running mate, essentially, but he announced his entire cabinet. He said, this is who's going to be my Secretary of Education, here, this is going to be my Secretary of Defense, this is going to be, whatever they are in Mexico. He named the people. If Joe Biden comes out and says, hey, it's going to be me and Stacey, it's going to ramp up the pressure on the other candidates to say, well, who would you pick as your running mate? And frankly, I think that tells you a lot about a candidate. In fact, I'd like to go farther than that. I'd like to say, okay, once we have a candidate, once we've got a nominee, once the primaries are over and the caucuses are over and the convention is over and we say, okay, it's going to be so-and-so and so-and-so. This is going to be our president and vice presidential candidates on the Democratic ticket. I think that they should take a cue from what Mexico did and say, here's who we're going to put in. I mean, can you imagine how many people would not have voted for Donald Trump if he had said that his Secretary of Commerce was going to be a billionaire who used to own a bank where other billionaires launder money? Wilbur Ross? A billionaire that Forbes magazine called a grifter? Would people in Michigan have voted for Donald Trump if he had said that Betsy DeVos, who kind of single-handedly pioneered, for-profit charter schools in Michigan to the point that, there's only about half the schools in Michigan now are public schools. People in Michigan know how toxic Betsy DeVos is. Could he have carried Michigan if he had announced that he was going to put this billionaire with her 10 yachts and her hatred of public schools in charge of education department? Would they have voted for him if he had said Alex Azar, the guy who let Jeffrey Epstein with all the, with 30 some odd, between 20 and 30 different charges of having sex with underage girls, was going to be our labor secretary? I mean, really? I think Americans would have said, seriously? You want to put Rick Perry, the guy who's like, talk about last in your class, right? You want to put Rick Perry, the guy who basically couldn't even remember the 3 agencies that he wanted to close, in charge of the agency that supervises our nuclear weapons, when Rick Perry thinks that that's the agency that supervises oil exploration, when it's not the Energy Department? I mean, really? That's what you're going to do, Donald Trump? I mean, had he announced his cabinet, it would have told us a whole lot more about him. I mean, does this establish a brand new era of expectations? Where do we go with this? I think it's fascinating. In fact, I think it's beyond fascinating. And, whether Biden does this or whether it's just a wild rumor, and apparently it's not a rumor. There's multiple members, people who are working with Joe Biden who have said, yes, he's considering this. And there are members of his staff who are saying, no way, don't do it. The danger is too great. Is it a danger? Is it a benefit?